I'll just reintroduce our speakers today. We have Alex Antscherl, who's editorial director at Enid Blyton Entertainment and Fiction Brands at Hachette Children's Group, and Emma Page, who is a translator and who's also our new PhD student here, one of our PhD students at the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing here at the University of Reading. So we're going to be discussing the translation of these books, Hachette's new famous 5 graphic novel series. And you can see the image there of them just on the screen. And in a second, I'm going to stop screen sharing because I'm going to start showing you all sorts of books in a second. Okay, right. So the idea of what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about the translation of these books, of this new famous 5 graphic novel series. So we're going to be exploring them, this retelling as graphic novels for the first time, and particularly thinking about them as translations, because the series is fascinating. It translates back into English the very recent French adaptations of Blyton's novels by Béja and Nataël, a father and son team of graphic novel experts. So together we're going to be talking about the French and the English books, the translation process, thinking about publishing Blyton, reimagining Blyton in the 21st century. And there'll be time at the end for questions. So please do make lots of use of the chat. We'll try and keep an eye on it, and certainly I'll be moderating questions at the end. So to kind of kick us off thinking about these books, what I'm first of all going to be doing is just taking a few moments to kind of think about, situate Enid Blyton, or should I say Enid Blyton, the French Enid Blyton, because these books are very much a product of French Blyton fan culture, if we can put it that way. So, you know, I think we're all aware Enid Blyton is very much a kind of a global phenomenon, read in all sorts of different countries and languages. And in France, she was wildly popular and really remains a staple. Her books, when they were published by Hachette in French translation, from the mid-1950s, sold millions of copies. I mean, in just 15 years, the famous 5, Le Club des 5, sold nearly 11 million copies. And so, you know, the famous 5 has been very much integrated into French children's culture, I would say. And they do transform her. They make her very much kind of integrate her into French culture. So the southwest coast of England, Dorset of Kieran Island, was very much easily translated, I think, into Brittany in French. And all that kind of famous Enid Blyton fascination for food, which, you know, she's so famous for, the bacon and eggs, the pies, the cakes, the bottles of ginger beer, are turned very easily into apple tarts and bowls of steaming coffee. So the French Club des 5 were also quite different. So they do all sorts of interesting things with the English source text, not just in terms of food. I think also the visual packaging. Can you all see this? That's working. Oh, good stuff. Okay. So the French illustrators, Simone Baudouin and Jeanne Ives, do all sorts of quite interesting things with the visual identity. I think we can say they sort of create more abstract kind of, there's a big contrast, I think, in these early 1960s editions with Eileen Soper, who kind of very much, there's this real evocation of holidays, adventure, place. Here, there's quite sort of mysterious, slightly abstract. This is another one. A lot of emphasis on mystery. And I could go on, but they do all sorts of things to the texts as well. But probably the greatest changes that the French carried out to the famous five, and I think also the greatest indicator really of the French love of the series, was in their continuation of it after Enid Blyton dies in 1968. So their sources dried up, and one of the erstwhile translators of Blyton, a very prolific author called Claude Voilier, turned her hand to keeping the famous five series going for Hachette in the 1970s. And here it gets quite wild. They go off to all sorts of far-flung places, from the Incas to the West Indies, hunting international criminals on cruises or facing hijackers in the Amazon. And you see, what's interesting is these books are then translated into English by the incomparable Anthea Bell. She's the translator who also brought us Asterix in English too. And then they inspire a comics series in the 1980s. So what I kind of wanted to say to sort of kick us off really thinking about these books is that there is quite a sort of a tradition, I think, of a cross-channel translation of Enid Blyton already, which stems really from this kind of strong French tradition of great admiration for Enid Blyton's books and for her famous five, and I think also of doing new and interesting things with them. And so these are the French ones. I've got the original French albums with nice big versions here. These date back from, I think, 2017, 2018, yes. And they're kind of in some ways very much a continuation of that sort of French tradition of doing interesting things with them, but also quite a departure in some ways from the French adaptations thus far, particularly with their kind of nostalgic feel, which we'll be thinking about. And I think that nostalgic feel in itself is also very much a sign of how kind of deeply embedded Enid Blyton's series is in French children's culture now. So without further ado then, I'd like us to hear more about the books. And so can I... Hello, I'm back again. I'd like to hand us over to Alex. And can I just ask you first of all then to present the books, talk to us about them, and explain to us what first interested you in this series, please?
Thanks, Sophie, and hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. And so Sophie's asked me to show you our British editions of these books, which have just come out a couple of weeks ago. This is book one, the graphic novel version of Five on a Treasure Island, or Five au Trésor de l'Île in its French original graphic novel version. And this is book two, which in English is rather prosaically called Five Go Adventuring Again, but has the rather more exciting title in French of Et le Passage Secret, which I personally prefer. And you'll see that we've chosen for this country to publish them only in the small format version, which the French have done too. So this is a bit more show and tell. This is our edition alongside the French edition in the same format. But before they went into this smaller paperback format, they published in the edition that Sophie just showed you, the big album style, which is much more familiar from Tintin and Asterix and so on. So in terms of what attracted me to them, obviously they're very beautiful books. The artwork is really reminiscent of that sort of classic French Bondicine. But we were a little cautious to start with. So although on a personal level, I thought, gosh, these are really beautiful and fun, they weren't part of our publishing plan for the Famous Five. They weren't really speaking to the audience that we thought we would be speaking to with the rest of our publishing. And we're a little reluctant, which is why it's taken us till 2022 to come on board with the idea of publishing some books which first came out in France 5 years ago. in all honesty, we looked at them and thought they're beautiful, but they're very French. And of course, for us in this country, although we're very appreciative of an understanding of the huge global appeal of Blyton, she is a quintessentially English writer. And the world that she creates is that very nostalgic one of English countryside childhood of the 1950s. And that's what it evokes for most people, whether they're reading it nostalgically, remembering that, or thinking that they remember it from their sort of grandparents' memories, or whether it's just the freedom and adventure that appeals to them for modern young readers. And we weren't sure that this sort of graphic novel format would really have a readership either with that nostalgic audience of parents and grandparents, or with the child readers of approximately 8 to 11, who are our normal audience for the core Famous Five novels. But then the market began to grow and change a little bit here in terms of the popularity and reception to graphic novels. And we began to have a lot more success, not so much on our own list at Hachette in the UK, but we saw our competitors doing more in this space. And then I will be honest and say that it came to a head when Hachette Livre had an offer from a different UK publisher, Expression of Interest, who wanted to publish the Famous Five graphic novels. They can't because we own all the intellectual property, but it did make us realize that there was interest in it. And we thought, right, this is the moment now when we can bring these to market in the UK for ourselves.
Lovely, thank you. There's so much in there that's fascinating. I think your point that they're very French is kind of fascinating for a start, and hopefully over the course of this conversation we're going to unpack that a little bit and kind of show our audience what just how I think they are really quite French. But one thing sort of struck me immediately was in France, the graphic novel format or comics, la bande dessinée, the BD, is so ubiquitous, and it's so kind of important part of sort of children's culture, and not just children's culture, you know, it's just so ever present. And so the idea of taking a sort of well-loved series and turning it into a bande dessinée, into a graphic novel, is quite normal. So I'm interested that you see it sort of coming in now a little bit in England, and where you kind of where that change is coming from, and in kind of.
I think it's a growing recognition of the importance of visual literacy and a broader acceptance among the sort of gatekeepers in the children's book industry, parents and grandparents, teachers, librarians, and others, that one way to put it is say it doesn't matter what they're reading as long as they're reading. And that was not the sort of traditional approach in the past. It was partly kicked off by a lot of black and white illustrated series, so rather than the sort of full colour bande dessinée style, things like Wimpy Kid, where there was a lot more interplay between text and illustration, and we saw how enormously popular that was with middle grade readers. And I mean, this sort of conventional wisdom maybe 10 years ago in the publishing industry was, oh, this is the way we can get boys to read that, you know, that hard to reach audience of 50% of the population, which, I mean, classically it is true that you tend to get more child readers, especially as you get older, and you lose kind of boy readers at 11 or 12. That's fortunately not so true anymore. And part of that change has come about, I think, through the wider acceptance of more visual forms of storytelling. And manga had a really big spike in interest kind of 5 years ago. And now you see it regularly, even in a tiny branch of Waterstones, for example, there'll be a manga display, which you certainly didn't get a few years ago. So I think just that probably, you know, the globalization of the world through the internet has helped that we're exposed to more cultural forces, more different forms of storytelling, and we are also really keen to find ways of speaking to those children who don't want to sit down with a conventional 300-page novel with no illustrations. It just doesn't appeal to them. So we're looking for ways to reach those audiences too.
Fascinating, thank you. Now, just to think about these in terms of kind of French bande dessinée BD culture, and, you know, when I saw these, first of all, I was so kind of struck by how Tintin-esque they were. You know, the sort of the drawing style, those quite sort of flat colors, the regular outlines, the attention to decor and place as well kind of really strikes me, and the sort of the nostalgic feel of them. So here, just for our audience, we have our opening there is Kirin Cottage, Villa des Mouettes, if you're interested in French. And so I kind of was curious what your thoughts were on how this kind of Tintin treatment of Blyton, what it brought to the Blyton universe.
I think that the sort of strictures of the BD form force the writer and illustrator to use a pacier, more direct form of storytelling, and that really suits the fact that these are adventure stories. They're child focused. They're very much about the quick page turning element of excitement in the discovering the treasure, foiling the baddies, winning the day, and that really works in this format beautifully. So I think that's part of the appeal. In terms of more the sort of specifics of it having that Tintin feel, I think it plays into the sort of nostalgic appeal of the books. For me, it was a really nice way of kind of approaching the twofold appeal, because obviously, as I said, we have these two audiences that we're always talking to in our publishing: the nostalgic audience, and who are often buying it for their grandchildren, but they're buying it because they remember the books fondly themselves. And so for them, the visual references will be those of a genuine sort of 1950s setting, and also the child audience who will like, there are obviously lots of child fans of Tintin, particularly of Asterix in this country, not so much, of course, as there are in France, but I think that there's to me, I can see the sort of historical side of it, the very 1950s feel, but I think that's not probably how it's interpreted by the average 8-year-old. They just look and see an attractive drawing that reminds them of some of those French BD series.
Thank you. Yeah, the nostalgic appeal of it is really strong, isn't it? And I'd like to pick up on the fact you sort of talk about your reluctance around the format and so forth. Could you develop that a little bit? Were there any aspects of this BD format that you were less sure of, or you were worried wouldn't work in English?
Not so much specifically to the format, although because of the format, you have to obviously compact the story into much less text, which obviously Emma might speak later about the challenge of that for her, and how you pick exactly the very few but correct amount of words to get the storyline across. And so it has not only compacted the story, but also had to change certain elements of it. And so the version of the Five on the Treasure Island story, for example, that appears in the graphic novel, has got different plot elements to the original novel, but it expresses its essence. So I suppose that was one of my reluctances at first. I was like, what is this flashback with pirates and obviously the treasure is always in there, but the historical flashback and the actual speaking about the pirates and sort of bringing them into the story is definitely not in the original book. And at first I looked at it and I actually, I had to ask my colleague, what is going on here? This is a completely different story in this book. And then obviously once I read it and realized, no, okay, it's a historical flashback, it does make sense. But I was a bit, as the kind of part of my job is being the guardian of this author's works, and I thought, oh, is it okay to play with the story in this way? But I came to the decision that absolutely was, if it's about producing a beautiful new book in a different but equally appealing format.
Thank you. We'll come back to the pirates. I'm going to ask Emma to talk at length. So we'll come back to those, because they are quite, there's some interesting things that they do with the storyline, isn't there? So they condense, but they do also sort of add and embroider quite a bit.
Yes.
And I was kind of curious because, you know, you're working for, you know, this is your English Hachette, but these are French Hachette books. And so how much interaction did you have with your French counterparts? You know, do you know much about where the French books came from? And also, did you have any contact with Béja and Nataël? Have you ever met them? Can you tell us about that sort of cross-channel interaction?
No, sadly not. I mean, I wish I had. I've watched videos of Béja talking about the book online, but no, partly because of the way, well, without kind of wishing to reveal any deep, dark secrets of publishing relationships, Hachette Livre, I think, consider themselves as much the owners of Blyton in France as we do of Blyton in the UK and the rest of the world. Although technically I should point out that it is actually a Hachette group in the UK who does own the intellectual property, but it's not how our cousins in Paris see it, really. So they do a lot of publishing within the brand that works for their market, and I am very happy about that. And that's so in some ways how we work with other partners in other parts of the world, but it's a particularly strong it's a particularly important part of their publishing, and they have been Enid Blyton's publishers nearly as long as Hodder and Stoughton, who are now part of Hachette, have been in the UK. So we've had Enid Blyton on our list since 1942, and the French since the mid-1950s. So we kind of often do our own thing. Had we collaborated at an earlier stage, I probably would have liked to speak with the graphic novel creators myself, but it wasn't really necessary because Dominique, my colleague at Hachette Livre, who commissioned them, he has got a really broad knowledge of this particular type of publishing and has all the right sort of knowledge and contacts and so on. And he, once he met Béja, he knew he wanted to do a graphic novel, and he kind of went out and looked for the right person, and it was when he found Béja that the project really took off, because he said this person had kind of represented the soul of what he wanted to create with a graphic novel version of Le Club des Cinq, because it's not just about doing a kind of straight book to graphic adaptation. It has to bring something new and sort of animate it in a way that makes it worth doing. So no, I'm afraid there was not a sort of lovely story of collaboration, but in a way it took the work away from me because Dominique did it.
Thank you. I did wonder whether I was being very sort of innocent and naive, kind of imagining all these.
sometimes there is much more interaction but generally, because each market is quite different, even within Europe, what normally happens, a little bit of kind of publishing admin background, we at Hachette have owned the intellectual property in Enid Blyton. Although we've been her publishers since 1942, we've only owned the IP since 2012. But since that point, all publishers licensing foreign rights from us do have to ask us for approval on any adaptations or new covers, new artwork, etc. So I do see and approve everything that's happening in every territory around the world, apart from France, where they like to just operate independently and tell us about it afterwards, because they really know what they're doing. They've done it for so long, and each of those markets understands what their readers need in a way that we can't advise on. So it's more about just making sure that we are giving out the same kind of positive message in all of those territories, rather than controlling and saying you must do it like this because we do it like this in London. They can do it whatever the way works for them.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm slightly relieved because I sort of, my sense was that Blyton has this real kind of like the Hachette kind of, she has this really important place in France, and
yeah, she really does.
Publishing. So thank you for confirming that. I suppose it's interesting to hear just how intense that is. What I would like us to do now is to move to think in a little bit more detail about the processes of adaptation and translation that we can really trace in these books, and perhaps if we could spotlight Emma as well, the translator, because and to sort of develop on that? That's from that sort of thing we were talking about, the Tintin-esque feel about the books and that attention. I think that real attention to place and decor that kind of comes through bringing through in the visual element as well. You know, you suddenly do have to kind of imagine it much more intensely. But, you know, what you were saying about Béja and Nataël really kind of running with it and making this their own story is quite clear. And so particularly, you know, the 1950s French books, as I said, set them in Brittany. And they seem to be having really good fun with the kind of regional setting. You find in the second book that you release, we have this quite sort of French looking farm with some Breton characters who struck me. I was really used to the sort of 1950s French versions, and we have these Breton local villagers who are using quite colourful religious, they're sort of invoking local saints, I think, which, you know, in 1950s, 1960s, Hachette would have been unthinkable. You know, that was still quite controversial. You wouldn't mention religion at all. So I was really quite amused to see that they'd obviously had that fun with kind of evoking the setting. But, you know, there are other ways that we've already alluded to where they kind of develop this sense of time and really play around with the Blyton universe, the Blyton story, by introducing new characters and new elements to the story of the famous five. So I'd like Emma now, if you could, I'm going to ask you how you, we've sort of talked about a couple of elements that you found. First of all, perhaps you could talk us through the Kirin family backstory and what the French text does, and then how you dealt with that, please.
Sure. This is my favorite little anecdote about this translation project, which was really fun in lots of ways. Yeah, so there is a moment in the first book, Five on Treasure Island, where the cousins have all just sort of shown up, and George is showing them the island. She's saying, that's Kirin Island, and she says, that's mine. Excuse me, I'm just going to change my headphones quickly. Should be able to hear me now. Is that all right? Great, perfect. So George shows them Kirin Island. She says, that's my island. The cousins are very impressed. Obviously, they want to know how it's her island. And so she tells them the story. And in the French version, she says, well, my family used to be really rich. Henry James Kirin, he has a slightly different name, obviously, in French, but he was really rich. But she says they lost all their money in the Revolution. Which obviously is not what happens in the original Blytons. That there was no English Revolution at that time in which all their money would have been taken. So I did have to check with Alex what we should do with this, which sort of agreed with my first instinct, which was just to change it back, basically. So in the English translation, she says something like, he lost all his money with some bad luck, basically, which is what Blyton says in the originals, but it is just indicative of that thing Sophie was saying about how incredibly localized these really are in France, that kind of a change would even be made.
Thank you. I think that kind of, that was one of the questions when you first told me about this whole project, was just how the process would work, because that's what's interesting, is you're translating a sort of a much loved French version of Blyton back into English, where she's, you know, so well known. How do you kind of, did you sit there with your kind of editions of English Blyton and try to kind of get some of that Blyton language back in, names, things like that? How did you handle that?
Yeah, so I mean, I did want to make sure, this was again my instinct, and then Alex certainly confirmed it, we didn't want to jar English readers who are familiar with the original. So there are some things that changed, some bits of the plot, stuff that changed around the graphic adaptation, but anything that could be located in the originals we didn't want there to be a contradiction. So I did sit with the books and check everybody's name. We had a couple of instances where somebody gained a name in the French versions. There's like a fisherman, Alfie's father, who's not named in the originals and is named at least in the graphic adaptations. And so I got rid of his name. He's now just referred to as Dad, or, you know, the same way he is in the originals. There's at least one sort of villain who gets a specific name in the graphic novels and is not named in the originals. So yeah, I did go through the text. I read Blyton for the tone, but I found that was not so useful because it's very descriptive, the originals in English. There's a lot of descriptive text, and there's none of that in these, obviously, because they're graphic. So, and there's a lot less dialogue in the originals. So the tone of voice, I think, is pretty much, Béja and Nataël really created those voices. And I think they're very true to this sort of the spirit of the original Blyton books. They match those characters, if you're familiar with them. But the actual language was not useful. And for instance, the thing you were mentioning about the farmers who live on their land. So as Sophie mentioned, they have a pretty strong dialect in these graphic novels. They really are using some local religious exclamations, and they kind of have an accent. And in the French originals, you can really hear it. And they don't even speak almost in the Blyton originals, or excuse me, they have maybe 1 or 2 lines of dialogue with no kind of dialect markers. So for that, I did choose to preserve what Béja and Nataël had done. So but of course they're located in the West Country, basically in Dorset. So I did my best to come up with some kind of West Country grandparent sounding voices. I consulted some friends who have grandparents from Dorset and asked them what they would be saying, and had some folks double check. Obviously, I'm not from there, so that was a little bit tricky. But I did add in sort of, oh my heavens and good Lord and things like that, which are kind of equivalent levels, I would say, of kind of local color.
That's fascinating. And I think that question of language struck me as quite interesting, because one of the things the French translations did in the 1950s was they kind of take Blyton's quite direct, dynamic storytelling style. In the 1950s, there was a lot of anxiety around education and a lot of scrutiny of children's literature in a way that you don't, you know, that Blyton isn't, well, subject to in different ways in the UK, I think. And so they do change her sentence structures around quite a lot. There's a lot more complicated sentences, and I was struck particularly in the second book, actually, where I think Béja, it's Nataël, isn't it, is kind of more, you know, there is some quite flowery language, and I thought you attenuated that ever so slightly in the English. Were you conscious of doing that?
I think probably not in so many words, but I do think that the perhaps French children's books are in a slightly more elevated register sometimes than English children's books are. So for the age group that this is aimed at, that kind of young middle reader set, the tone in French was just a little bit, it risked sounding really stiff, like really old-fashioned, and not in the kind of appealing nostalgic way that you want, but in kind of an off-putting way. And I also think that the graphic novel, I know what you're talking about there. Some of these sort of the sidebar bits that are kind of descriptive are quite flowery in the second one. And that doesn't really suit a graphic novel in a British context. I mean, I think you want to keep it pretty minimal. People aren't expecting to read kind of even short paragraphs of description in there because the illustrations are so great and the dialogue is great. That's kind of what's driving it. So yeah, I would say I pulled it back to make it sound more kind of age appropriate to the audience for this type of book. And I think that probably is a cultural difference around, yeah, language in children's books.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I suppose, and Alex, do feel free to kind of come in on this as well. I was curious about food, and I don't think we can have a conversation about Blyton without talking about food. And obviously when it's sort of a visual storytelling form like we've got here, and we have these sort of breakfast scenes where they're eating crêpe and brioche, and they're drinking from these big bowls. Do I have it? Yes, we have crêpe and brioche, and they're drinking from bowls. Which is so French, and she's got a lovely pot of coffee, which I just feel is so utterly un-Blyton. How did you? I mean, I guess for Emma the translation actually seems to have been fairly straightforward. But Alex, did you have reservations about that, or did you think it could just kind of pass through? I guess.
I mean, I think the latter probably. I did look at it and think, anybody who knows anything about British culture or French culture will instantly look at that breakfast scene and realise that's in France. It couldn't be anywhere else, and it certainly would be in Dorset in the 1950s. With, I think Fanny has a Bialetti on the stove and a big bowl of coffee for each of the children. But it kind of, in the interests of working with what we've got, and it is very beautiful, we just felt that it was better to slightly pass over that, translate it in a way that would be accessible, and just assume that the children would kind of understand. You only really need to understand that they're having a very pleasurable breakfast for the scene to work.
I think for me, looking at that, I mean, there is specifically one scene where they sort of say crêpe brioche, and I said pancakes or muffins. And I do think if you're, as a child, if you're not, it's interesting how much will pass. I think they do look very French if you're aware of it, but particularly for a younger audience, sort of if you read pancakes or muffins, that sort of looks like a picture of pancakes and muffins. If you're not aware of what it is, I think the bowls of coffee, that is so far outside of the British consciousness that they just read as cereal bowls. There's just no thought that they would even be bowls of coffee, for a child at least, who's just read that they're having breakfast. So yeah, the fact the liquid in one of them is brown and not white, I just don't think a child would necessarily notice that. And I think that's actually true about a lot of the setting, like you say, the sort of French farmhouses and the coast. It's quite distinctive once you've had it pointed out, or if you know that these are coming from France. But I think that we do kind of have to, like, children just sort of take things like that in stride very much. And I think even adult readers, you just sort of, there's so much in Dorset in the British imagination that I think that a lot of that kind of gets read into being an English countryside, actually, because you just can't imagine them being in France if you're in the UK,
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you. Can I just sort of end this this little bit by asking about gender? Because there is that kind of nostalgic 1950s setting that the books bring out, the Béja, I think, when you see him in videos, he's dressed, he's quite a dandy, and he seemed to be in +4s at one stage in one of the videos I've seen. So the sartorial thing, the detail, the interest in the clothes strikes me as quite important. And so I was fascinated by Aunt Fanny, who strikes me as very un-Aunt Fanny, who in this Eileen Soper illustration, she's quite tweedy, I think is the adjective that comes to mind. And I thought that was quite interesting. This woman here really reminds me of the sort of 1950s Moulinex adverts, sort of women in ecstasies over their new washing machines and so forth. And I guess also sort of visualizing it, she's suddenly serving them breakfasts. The Enid Blyton books, they get breakfast, there's food on the tables, but we don't necessarily realize that it's the mother who's serving them and so forth. So by visualizing it, it's suddenly more present, I think. So I was curious about that. And also there in the French text as well, there's a little bit of this sexism kind of, the boys at one stage sort of talk about girls being chatterboxes. And later on, George Claude, we learn that she's a feminist, and she's got these sort of books about suffragettes that she sort of keeps, and that's how she kind of copes with being a girl who wants to be a boy in the 1950s. It's something that he explores in quite interesting ways. I was curious as to kind of how this was handled in the English text, and sort of, again, this sort of the interplay between the visual universe that he's creating and perhaps what you want to do with Blight in an English context. So I wondered, perhaps either one of you, if you'd like to chat a little bit about that, please.
Do you want me to start, Emma, and then maybe you can speak about how you sort of took it down on the literal level? And I agree that Aunt Fanny has become somewhat more glamorous than she used to be in this vision. But as you say, having seen the films of Béja, I think that is his personal style slightly reflected in his artwork. So I'm sort of happy to embrace it visually. And there are, in a way, the wonderful thing about the Famous Five is that actually it so overturned many of the gender stereotypes of its day, and that's why people remember George, and she's such a resonant character for so many young readers, and she stays with you for decades after you've read the book, because she was really in many ways completely ahead of her time. So there are other elements of the books which are more traditional and typical, but I think it's sort of very well balanced out by what Blyton did around George, and it's part of our publishing policy is to make sure that the books are accessible to every reader now. So obviously we have removed anything which it could be offensive to readers now, but it is also about recognizing that these are period pieces. Effectively, they were written in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, and some of her writing does reflect attitudes towards gender and other aspects of society that aren't appropriate or acceptable now, but were quite commonplace in her era. So as I say, we sort of the policy is generally to remove offensive things, but to recognize that these are period pieces. So they weren't part of it has a very long and complex publishing history, as you can imagine, for a book that's been in print for 80 years. But part of the trend for a long time was to try and keeping them modern. But I have made a decision not to do that, so that it's clear to a child reading this book in 2022 that it was set decades ago. So we reverted back to using pounds, shilling and pence, and the language around, for example, bathing suit rather than swimmers, or whatever kids might say now. We've reverted where it's relevant and where it's not offensive to the original language. So that, because I found, my feeling was that if you kept trying to update it but not change the plot, then you would surely hope that a child would read it and say, but mummy, why does Anne always have to do the washing up? Whereas if you understand as a child that it's not taking place today, then if you do ask that question, at least you can then, it would open up a discussion around, well, it was different when this book was written, and Anne probably would have been expected to do the washing up while Julian and Dick got to climb a tree, and here's why. And isn't it great that that's not the case now, hopefully, for most girls. So that was a very rambling answer, but I hope you got the gist. Emma, what about the actual language?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was translating this, I felt that obviously it had been so kind of already transformed in the form of this graphic novel quite recently, that there, most of the sort of things that have to questions about whether you would to update Blyton or sort of what period it was set and all of that had really been handled, and I think very well, very sensitively, and even just on the level of the language, it's very readable while also being nostalgic at the same time. So, I think that Béja and Nataël really nailed that balance quite nicely. So for me, in my original translation, I didn't sort of change anything that they had done. I mean, obviously, I did change the kind of voice to be English, but as far as the tone and the kinds of words that they're using and that kind of thing, I did stick with it. There were some edits made to my translations that were changes that were just sort of interesting to me. I mean, I think there's obviously a difference between France and the UK in terms of publishing. I know one term I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about, Alex, is the word tomboy, which the French term, for those of you who don't speak French, is garçon manqué, which is literally sort of like should have been a boy, much more literally than the English is. And that term gets used just a couple of times in the books. People sort of refer to George as a tomboy. And generally, I think it's somewhat derogatory when it's used, but it's definitely part of the context of sort of why she feels so rebellious. You know, she does have this kind of feminist streak to her, which is very explicit. And she is rebelling against that sort of characterization of her. But I did notice that in the English versions, the final ones, that was not included. The word tomboy was removed, although the attitude sort of is still definitely there. And yeah, so I would definitely be interested to hear what Alex's thoughts are on that. But
thanks, Emma. Yes, it's one of my kind of great regrets that we don't have a good equivalent phrase for garçon manqué. It's such a neat way of expressing it. I probably don't fully appreciate the cultural implications of it in France. And it may be that it's now a controversial phrase there in the same way that some people consider tomboy to be here. So Sophie, you may be able to advise on that more, but I felt that if there had been the equivalent phrase that worked in English, I would have kept it in. But questions around gender and how George feels about it are obviously like even more sensitive and more interesting than they ever have been in this 80-year history of this book. And so I felt essentially we just took out that phrase. On the first page of the French edition, her father says, "Where is she? The garçon manqué ou pas?" And it carries on talking about he's really annoyed with her because she's gone missing when she's supposed to be looking after her cousins. And it works just as well without that particular phrase, "Where is she? I'm annoyed she's supposed to be looking after her cousins," without drawing attention on that very first mention of her to her gender questioning.
That's so interesting because it means that you meet George later, essentially, doesn't it? Because that garçon manqué is sort of this introduction to her. You haven't seen her yet, but you get this idea, oh, there's a tomboy about kind of thing. And so I guess that's what's interesting about it is as soon as you see her, you know, that tomboy thing comes through loud and clear. It's definitely in there. But yeah, it is also sort of the third word in the book. So yeah, very interesting.
And it is the father, of course, the patriarchal authority who kind of introduces. So it is quite powerful, and I could kind of see that sort of the desire to tone that down a little bit. I think that's really interesting. Thank you both. I'm aware that time is marching on, actually. There was a lot to say about these books, and I just wanted to kind of close really by asking Alex, you know, I think we've been brought to the 21st century and sort of how these books fit into the sort of wider Blyton brand at Hachette and you know, place them in the context of what you're doing with Blyton and lots of reimaginings. And I hadn't expected you to say just how they were quite unusual for your the sort of Blyton strategy. So do you see, if you could just chat to us a little bit about that to kind of close this, please.
Sure, thank you for asking that. And that, yeah, I think that unusual in that our other publishing hasn't been in this sort of properly BD format. We have done other colour publishing of Blyton, but it's been targeted at younger readers as a way of taking the stories down to a younger age group. So we have colour short stories with very contemporary illustrations and either original, slightly abridged, or brand new stories about the same characters for the famous five and for some of the other series. Essentially, our publishing plan for Blyton is to try and create a Blyton book, publish a Blyton book for every age and stage of reading development and of your childhood, so that you can kind of grow up with Blyton, but also to maintain the loyalty and affection of those adult fans who've grown up with her themselves and want to pass on the love to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren now. But it's also because I mentioned earlier that we own all the intellectual property in Enid Blyton's work. So it's not just about our book publishing. We also look for opportunities to offer entertainment in multiple media all around the world. So I don't know if any of you have noticed the Mallory Towers adaptation that's been on BBC, children's BBC, in the last couple of years. That's something that we've really enjoyed collaborating on, and we have potential film and television deals coming for some of the other series too. So it's about kind of keeping her all that's best about her world and all the things that she embodied in her writing, which are still appealing and are still relevant, but making them accessible to children in a way that's appropriate today. So the spirit of adventure, the strong friendships and relationships, love of the countryside in particular, and love of food. Of course, we just briefly touched on that before.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that mention actually of television sort of reminded me of the other big French adaptation, and kind of, you know, the French doing all sorts of interesting things. And of course with Blyton, and that's the Noddy TV series as well. They're doing all sorts of things in television that I hadn't remembered to put in my introduction, but you know, there's all sorts of things going on. But I'm conscious it would be quite nice, while we've got Emma and Alex here, and we've got our audience, all 70 of you or so forth, there seems to be lots of questions coming up. So I can see one here from Vivienne, who asks, do you plan to publish English translations of any more of this series of the French BD? Are we going to see more of this?
The French have, as you possibly know, Vivienne, have published, I think they are on book, they're approaching book 8 at the moment. So we will do, if we have commercial success with these two, it will be a commercial decision.
Yeah, it's too early to tell, isn't it?
They've only been out a couple of weeks.
I put in my original email, you know, has there been any reception? You know, have you got any sense of what's going on, or it's too early to tell, I guess?
It's a little bit early to tell. I think we haven't had any negative reception, so I'd say they're really appealing to fans. So Forbidden Planet, for example, the specialist graphic novel shop, have really embraced them and did a special offer for their readers of prints that created specially. So if you bought your copy through Forbidden Planet, you got a beautiful print of the artwork that you could frame for your wall. And people who are, I'd say they're really working for people who are existing graphic novel or BD fans. I think they've yet to sort of cut through to the ordinary reader, if you like, people who would generally be shopping in more broad mass market bookstores or online.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I did look in my local bookshop and couldn't see them. They do have a tiny graphic novel section, but couldn't see them. Oh, we've got an interesting one here. Someone's saying how they love the way the role of the editor, the publisher, is being, you know, brought into this discussion of the translation process, and how, you know, you've clearly played a key role in the final work. Alison asks, out of interest, in which foreign markets is Blyton less popular and has less appeal?
Oh, interesting question, and an easy one to answer. America. She's on loan there virtually. And I have an American colleague who works very closely with me on this brand, selling our TV and film rights primarily. And her explanation for it, I think, is a really interesting one. She says that in the US, the 1950s personified a time when people were looking forward. It was the kind of the jet age, the space age. Everything was about modernism, exciting new travel and fashion and so on. Whereas I think in the UK, a lot of what the 1950s was about was evoking the kind of golden age, trying to remember what we'd been like pre-war, trying to ignore the fact that we still had rationing until 1954, and hoping to kind of recreate ye olde England. In that space, Blyton worked really well, whereas for the States it felt too archaic and backward looking. I think it's also that they were quite insular, and probably also not helped by the fact that she quite loudly advocated her dislike of American comics. I don't know what she would have made of a graphic novel version. I think these are beautiful. I think she would have embraced them, but she was not a fan of what she saw as this sort of comic book culture of the States.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Just on that note, I can confirm, having grown up in America, that although I did have some Blyton, that was having Anglophile and very bookish parents, and it was very, very unusual. They were not popular. Yeah,
I can imagine.
Fascinating. while these are, Robin asks, while these are aimed at younger readers, was there any temptation to tip a hat to mature graphic novel readers or parents with a witty remark or cultural reference that might go over children's heads?
I slightly think that is in there in some of the dialogue. Emma, you can probably speak to that better than me.
Yeah, I definitely think that they have they do have that kind of, the way Tintin does, sort of, there is kind of a wink and a nod, nothing too much, but yeah, certainly there are some references. There's one scene just visually where the kids are going through a shed to make sort of some toys and sleds and stuff, and they put on some gas masks. That's kind of an interesting one. That's just, they don't address it at all, but obviously would be an adult reader to kind of look at that and explain what it is, why have they got gas masks in the shed. And yeah, I think that in general, some of George's attitude and kind of the way she behaves is certainly very kind of interesting and appealing as an older reader. So I think that they have that attitude to them to some degree. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's that, even just the nostalgia of them, I think, has that kind of appeal to the, I think, Alex, you talked about, you appeal to the grandparents and the parents and the children, and I think the nostalgic imagery kind of strikes me as doing that. Andrew asks, the potential age range of Blyton's readers is quite interesting. So do you have any sense of what it is now? I think you did mention that at the beginning, but Blyton apparently thought that the upper end was 15.
Yeah. Can I just draw attention? Andrew, hello. Andrew has just written a brilliant biography of Enid Blyton, which is published on the Palgrave Macmillan list. I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to know more about how she fits into the cultural context of the 1950s. His book is excellent on that. And yes, I think it is a really interesting reflection on the way the concept of the teenager has emerged and the growth of youth culture, and the differentiation between sophistication against reading age has sort of switched around now compared to how it was when Blyton was first writing. And we generally think of the upper end of appeal for Famous Five as being sort of 11 to 12, whereas I think it probably was 15. And the writing, it's not that the writing is too simple for 15-year-olds to enjoy, it's just that the sense of sophistication among 15-year-olds now would mean it'd be less likely for them to be reading Famous Five. Although I do know that in some very religious communities still, they're always recommended because they're safe. There's no sex, drugs and rock and roll in them.
Didn't know that. That's really interesting. Thank you. David joined it late, so I think you might have missed, David, some of our extensive discussion of the food, but it does kind of the question of just how Frenchified Blyton becomes and their food is something that he's kind of interested to know about. And his uncle was an actor who played Uncle Quentin in a Blyton spoof for the comic strip. I remember that.
It launched Channel 4 the night it opened.
Did it? I didn't know that. I'm sort of
Can I just quickly answer? I see this question from Tonka. Blyton is really popular in Eastern Europe. She is, I can't remember if she's translated into Bulgarian, but I have certainly recently approved translations in Slovenian, Slovakian, Croatian, Russian, controversially now, and various other Eastern European languages. So she is very popular there.
And are there any other countries where they've done so many different? Is Germany? Yes, I was just wondering. Is it just France and Germany? I mean, is there something about Blyton's work that inspires these kind of lots and lots of different adaptations, or is this quite specific? There's just Germany. What do the Germans do again?
So the Germans are huge fans of the Famous Five as well, Die Fünf. And they have expanded particularly in a format which is really specific to Germany, I believe, called the Hörspiel, the audio play. So they used to be on the radio in Germany in the 50s, 60s, I think up till the 80s. Then they switched them to CD, and now you can buy them as digital downloads. But they're dramatized stories about the famous five, and they have continued long past the original 21 books that she wrote. I think they are on story number 144 at the moment. And they do several each year, new stories, putting just more and more and more adventures of, you know, kind of challenging baddies for the famous five to overcome every time.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Well, I think I can feel that the chat is sort of, there's been lots of interesting comments, but I think it's probably we're running out of questions, and I think the main thing I kind of wanted to say was thank you to Alex for joining us, and thank you, Emma, for talking to us and giving us so many insights into the translation process. Hopefully it's really nice to kind of think of these as translations and sort of think about that kind of cross-channel sharing and learning. She's very popular in Spain as well, apparently. And so thank you so much, and thank you as ever to our audience for all your wonderful contributions. And yes, we'll be popping this recording online, and hopefully if it's worked, and lovely to see you all, and just say goodbye to all. Thank you very much, and Liz, when you're ready, I guess you can sort of switch us off.